This morning, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark 6-3 decision, striking down the Trump administration's sweeping tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods. The ruling dismantles a trade policy that shaped the American economy for years, sending shockwaves through Washington and beyond. Phones rang off the hook in Congress, business leaders scrambled, and Wall Street surged as investors processed the news. More than a policy reversal, this decision rebalances power between the executive and legislative branches. For years, presidents invoked national security to justify broad economic actions. Today, the court drew a new, clear line. The tariffs, controversial from the start, were hailed by supporters as protection for American jobs and industries, especially against China. Opponents warned of higher prices, retaliatory tariffs, and harm to farmers and exporters. The debate has been central to American politics, and now, the Supreme Court has weighed in decisively. Few expected the court to intervene so boldly, especially on such a politically charged issue. The legal basis, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, had been challenged before, but never with this result. The court's new, stricter criteria for invoking national security in trade marks a monumental shift. As of December 24, 2025, the nation is left to grapple with what this means for jobs, businesses, and the future of the economy. The shock is palpable, and the implications are just beginning to unfold. This is a pivotal moment in the ongoing story of American trade. The country now faces a new era of economic policy and constitutional balance. The Supreme Court's ruling directly challenges decades of expanding presidential power over trade. Presidents have long used national security as a broad justification for unilateral action, but the Trump administration pushed this further than ever. The court now requires a clear, direct link between a specific import and a tangible national security threat. General arguments about industry health no longer suffice. This forces presidents to build strong, evidence-based cases before imposing tariffs, shifting power back to Congress. Future administrations will face higher legal hurdles and must work more closely with lawmakers. The era of the trade warrior president acting alone may be over. Americans are now confronted with a new reality. Congress, not the president, will set the direction on trade. The decision reignites debate over who should control America's economic relationships. It's a legal earthquake, and Washington must now adjust to a rebalanced system. The aftershocks of this ruling will shape U.S. trade policy for years. To grasp today's decision, we must revisit the Trump administration's aggressive trade agenda. In 2018, tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum were imposed globally, including on allies under Section 232. The administration argued these industries were vital for national defense, but the move sparked fierce debate. The trade war escalated with China, leading to tariffs on hundreds of billions in goods and Chinese retaliation targeting U.S. agriculture. Supporters saw the tariffs as a lifeline for American manufacturing, pointing to reopened mills and new investments. Opponents, manufacturers, farmers, and retailers argued the tariffs were a hidden tax, raising costs and costing jobs. Economic studies showed gains in protected industries but greater losses elsewhere. Legal challenges mounted, claiming presidential overreach. One such challenge reached the Supreme Court, setting the stage for today's historic ruling. The legacy of these policies is now being rewritten by the court's decision. At the heart of this saga is a constitutional question. Who controls American trade policy? The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but over time, Congress delegated some authority to the president for flexibility. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allowed the president to restrict imports threatening national security, but was used sparingly until the Trump era. The administration's broad use of national security sparked a constitutional debate over executive overreach. Legal scholars and lawmakers argued Congress never intended for Section 232 to justify sweeping trade wars. The Supreme Court's intervention was about more than tariffs. It was about restoring the separation of powers. By striking down the tariffs, the court reasserted Congress's primary role in trade and checked decades of expanding presidential authority. The balance of power has shifted back to the legislative branch. The majority opinion, authored by the Chief Justice, asserts judicial review over executive trade actions. Rather than striking down Section 232, the court set a new, rigorous standard. The executive must show a direct, verifiable link between a specific import and a real national security threat. General economic competition or industry health is no longer enough. The court emphasized that national security cannot be a loophole for bypassing Congress. Any future use of Section 232 now requires a detailed public report, a direct connection to the threat, and a narrowly tailored remedy. This doctrine makes it much harder for presidents to impose broad tariffs. The dissent argued the court was overreaching, but the majority prevailed, setting a new precedent. Presidential power in trade is now clearly limited, even in the name of national security. U.S. trade policy has entered a new era of judicial oversight. The Supreme Court's decision sent financial markets soaring. Dow Jones up 500 points with similar gains in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ. Investors welcomed the end of tariff-driven instability, hoping for a more predictable trading environment. Companies reliant on imports or exports to China saw their stocks surge, while domestic steel and aluminum producers tumbled. The market's reaction highlights the winners and losers of tariff policy: relief for manufacturers and retailers, pain for protected industries. Yet, uncertainty lingers. Trade tensions with China remain unresolved, and the future of U.S. trade policy is unclear. Investors are watching to see how Congress and the administration respond. Will new trade legislation emerge? Will negotiations resume? The initial euphoria is tempered by the knowledge that the path forward is still uncertain. The end of tariffs is just the beginning of a new chapter. The market is recalibrating, and the stakes for the economy remain high. The story of American trade is far from over. The Supreme Court's decision has split the nation along familiar lines. Manufacturers building complex products celebrate. Tariffs had raised their costs and hurt competitiveness. In steel towns, workers fear for their jobs, seeing the tariffs as a lifeline now lost. For them, the court's decision feels like a betrayal favoring big corporations over American workers. Farmers, hit hard by Chinese retaliation, mostly welcome the ruling, hoping to regain lost export markets. The benefits of free trade are broad but diffuse. The costs are concentrated and deeply felt in certain communities. This tension fuels the ongoing political debate over trade. The court's decision may be legally sound, but it doesn't resolve the economic and social divides at the heart of U.S. trade policy. The nation's struggle over trade is far from settled. The Supreme Court's ruling reverberated worldwide. U.S. allies in Europe, Canada, and Mexico welcomed the decision, seeing it as a return to rules-based trade and a chance to rebuild trust. The European Commission called it a step toward de-escalation and normalized relations. Allies hope for a more predictable U.S. trade policy and closer cooperation. In China, the reaction was measured. State media framed the ruling as evidence of U.S. legal turmoil, but leaders see economic opportunity in the removal of tariffs. The core disputes between the U.S. and China remain unresolved, and strategic competition will continue. The decision also strengthens global institutions like the WTO, which had been undermined by unilateral U.S. tariffs. International leaders hope the U.S. will now favor multilateral solutions to trade disputes. The world is watching to see if America's new approach will bring stability or new challenges to global commerce. The impact of this ruling extends far beyond U.S. borders. With the court's decision, Congress must now lead on trade policy. Lawmakers can no longer defer to the president. They must craft new rules, balancing protectionism and free trade. The debate will be fierce, with deep divisions both between and within parties. Congress faces tough questions. How to protect national security, how to compete with China, how to support workers and consumers. The process will be messy and political, but it marks a return to constitutional norms. The era of unilateral president-led trade wars is over. The future of American trade now rests with 535 members of Congress. Their choices will shape the economy for decades to come.